In the spring of 1941, the streets of Paris still smelled faintly of spring blooms and gasoline. Cafes hummed with chatter, newspapers screamed headlines about British resistance, and yet, behind the ornate facades, the wheels of a different war were turning, one that would never happen in the way history recorded. Hitler, sitting in his Reich Chancellery office in Berlin, read reports from his generals. Intelligence suggested the Soviet Union was unprepared for winter conflict, its supply lines vulnerable, and yet his advisors warned of logistical nightmares. In this alternate history, the Führer paused. For once, the impulse to strike eastward was tempered by caution, by the seductive logic of consolidating power in the West first. Berlin's air was heavy with cigarette smoke and tension. General Jodl argued for Barbarossa. It is now or never. Stalin is weak, and the Wehrmacht is strong. Delay will cost us the opportunity of a lifetime. But Hitler, unusually reflective, leaned back in his leather chair and said, "Not yet. We have France, the Low Countries, Norway. Let us finish the West. The East will wait until winter weakness." The room fell silent, the generals exchanging nervous glances. They knew the consequences of defiance were dire, yet this time the decision would ripple outward in ways none could foresee. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill paced his office late into the night, peering at maps of Europe. Radio broadcasts from occupied France told stories of resistance, of saboteurs in rail depots, of pockets of defiance he had long feared. But suddenly, intelligence arrived that no German army was massing along the Soviet frontier, that the Eastern Campaign had been indefinitely postponed. The news brought both relief and concern. If Hitler turned fully west, Britain would face a more intense air war, a more calculated campaign against the Royal Navy, and a longer blockade aimed at starving the islands into submission. Meanwhile, in the remote Siberian outposts, Russian commanders noticed unusual inactivity along the Western Front. Soviet peasants continued harvesting spring wheat, unaware that an invasion that should have come in June had been delayed indefinitely. Stalin's staff, impatient and suspicious, scolded generals for their caution. They had expected war, had drilled for it, and yet it did not come. Soldiers practiced maneuvers, drills repeated endlessly in the muddy terrain, while the winter-hardened tanks rested in hangars, waiting. The uncertainty gnawed at everyone. The enemy might be anywhere, but for now, he was nowhere. In Paris, resistance cells found themselves in a curious state of limbo. The Gestapo still patrolled, the checkpoints remained, but the continent's attention had shifted. Supplies intended for the Russian front accumulated in Antwerp and Rotterdam, while German engineers pored over plans to reinforce the Atlantic Wall. Saboteurs learned to move with a subtle timing, striking trains carrying weapons and personnel, yet the overall tempo of occupation slowed. The ordinary people, bakers, shopkeepers, mothers, felt the strange calm, but it was uneasy. Danger was always nearby, but its shape had changed. Across the English Channel, radar operators in Kent tracked Luftwaffe flights, now concentrated entirely on the British Isles. The Battle of Britain intensified. German planes striking in larger waves. Night raids focused on ports and industrial centers. Londoners huddled in shelters, counting the hours between sirens. Pilots flew sorties over the Channel with the knowledge that each mission now mattered more than ever. Squadrons of Spitfires chased Dornier and Heinkel bombers. The sky streaked with tracer fire. And yet, the intensity was different, calculated. A focused offensive rather than a continent-spanning overreach. In the towns of northern France and Belgium, young men who would have been dispatched east found themselves building fortifications instead. Trenches, Bunkers and anti-tank positions rose along the Channel coast. These soldiers, often barely trained and untested, spent months preparing for an invasion that never came. It was dull, repetitive, and yet it hardened them in ways the eastward campaign never would have. Morale was fragile, yet discipline held. A brittle calm before storms that might come in the future. In Moscow, Stalin fretted endlessly. He convened meetings in the Kremlin, pacing the long corridors. The intelligence reports were inconsistent. Spies returned with vague stories of German hesitancy. Had the Wehrmacht really turned west? Was Hitler reconsidering everything? The Soviet leadership, paralyzed by fear and pride, began to rethink deployments, reinforcing western districts unnecessarily, while leaving other fronts lightly defended. Entire armies trained in place, waiting for an enemy who had delayed his arrival. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched with fascination and dread. The Japanese in the Pacific, sensing the German pivot westward, adjusted their own strategy. Pearl Harbor became inevitable, but the timing shifted slightly. Japanese officers debated carefully, understanding that a Britain under heavier bombardment might collapse sooner, allowing Tokyo to consolidate without immediate interference from American forces. Washington responded cautiously, sending additional aid to Britain while accelerating naval deployments in the Pacific. In occupied Paris, a young French journalist named Étienne Lefebvre noticed the change in German behavior. Checkpoints were tighter, but fewer patrols moved east. Supplies intended for the Russian front piled in warehouses. Étienne began documenting subtle cracks in the occupation. Stories of German soldiers reluctant to leave France, of deserters, of local resistance taking small victories without much notice. His notebooks grew heavy with observations, each entry a silent rebellion, a record of how one pause in command could change thousands of lives. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler watched photographs of the Atlantic Wall, reviewing fortifications in Holland, France, and Norway. "We must be absolute," he said. "Every port, every dock, every railway, nothing left unguarded." The generals around him were tense. This focus on the West gave them time to breathe, to consolidate resources. Yet it also allowed the Allies to prepare more thoroughly. Intelligence agencies in London and Washington sensed the shift. Codebreakers intercepted plans that suggested an obsession with ports over eastern conquests, and strategies were adjusted accordingly. In the forests of Belgium, a resistance fighter named Marie-Claude moved silently among the trees. She had once thought the Eastern campaign would distract German attention, giving them room to sabotage trains and depots. Now, she noticed German engineers reinforcing the same railways she had intended to target. Every delayed decision in Berlin reverberated across the continent, a butterfly effect of tension and subtle victories. Her reports reached London via radio, and British command began adjusting commando operations to exploit the German preoccupation with the West. The winters of 1941 to 42 arrived differently. Soldiers stationed along the Channel coasts faced harsh conditions, but unlike the freezing Russian plains, their enemy was monotony, supply shortages, and the psychological weight of being held in place. In the forests of Belarus, Soviet troops trained vigorously, unaware that the Germans were still months away from them. Stalin's paranoia grew, yet the gap in action allowed Soviet engineers to build fortifications, move reserves, and train tank units with precision that might never have existed otherwise. Across the Mediterranean, North Africa became a different theater as well. Rommel, observing the delay in the Eastern campaign, gained a temporary advantage. German and Italian forces could concentrate on the desert front. Tobruk, El Alamein, and other key positions saw heavier clashes, yet the Allies had slightly more time to prepare logistics, air support, and reinforcements. The war in Africa became a chessboard of patience and attrition, rather than sudden, catastrophic strikes. Back in London, Churchill's eyes tired from endless maps and meetings, yet he allowed himself a rare smile. The German overreach into the Soviet Union had not yet occurred. Britain's survival, already tenuous, had an unexpected cushion. American aid could flow more efficiently, factories continued to churn out tanks and aircraft, and intelligence operatives in occupied Europe gained time to expand networks. One decision in Berlin, a pause in timing, a moment of hesitation, was shifting the entire trajectory of the war. In the villages of Western Russia, families who would have been evacuated or lost to the immediate invasion lived in quiet uncertainty. Soldiers drilled, peasants farmed, and the spring sun rose over fields untouched by battle. The Soviet Union, though wary and suspicious, had bought precious months that would allow industrial relocation, better training, and preparation for the eventual confrontation. The scales of history had tilted, not by armies, but by a single, fateful decision. And so the war continued, but not as history remembers it. The world teetered on a different edge. Britain still threatened, the Soviet Union still cautious, the Axis powers stronger in Europe, yet vulnerable in a new pattern. The lives of millions shifted imperceptibly. A French teenager who joined the resistance, a Soviet commander who survived to lead troops in a different campaign, a British pilot who gained critical experience over the Channel, an engineer in Karachi whose supply shipments reached Burma on time. Each ripple traced back to the choice made in Berlin, a pause that became a pivot, an alternate thread in the vast tapestry of global conflict. By the summer of 1942, the delay in Operation Barbarossa had begun to reshape the entire European theater. Moscow was no longer bracing for immediate destruction. Factories that in the original timeline would have been evacuated under duress now hummed with relative calm. Women worked alongside men in assembly lines producing T-34 tanks and Katyusha rocket launchers. The raw steel of Soviet industry was still harsh and unpolished, but it was complete, fortified, and ready. Engineers, previously scattered to hastily repaired workshops, now had the luxury of time. Each tank rolled off the assembly line with care, not desperation, and every soldier who trained to operate them had the benefit of months of rehearsal. In Berlin, Hitler was consumed by the obsession of the West. France remained under occupation, but the Atlantic Wall grew stronger, deeper, more formidable. In coastal Normandy, engineers poured concrete into bunkers, dug trenches for artillery, and installed intricate minefields. Soldiers stationed there grew increasingly restless, aware that their hours were filled with preparation, not glory, and that the promised Eastern conquest remained suspended indefinitely. Yet their discipline was rigid. The Führer's orders were law, and law was unquestionable. In London, the pause in the East allowed British intelligence to focus entirely on the West. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park intercepted German communications that revealed not only troop dispositions, but also supply bottlenecks, revealing weaknesses in Hitler's obsessive focus on fortifications. Commanders used this time to train paratroopers, refine amphibious landing strategies, and coordinate closely with the Free French and Polish units in exile. Every delay the Germans created inadvertently strengthened the very forces they hoped to subdue. Meanwhile, in occupied France, the resistance began to sense opportunity. Young men and women, once scattered and cautious, now organized more daring sabotage missions. Rail depots exploded under the cover of night. Telegraph lines were cut with precision. German convoys were ambushed along narrow countryside roads. Among them was a young operative, Lucien Moreau, who had narrowly escaped capture the previous winter. He moved with the confidence of someone who had learned patience. Every day the Germans postponed their eastward campaign. Every shipment of artillery and supplies redirected to the west created new vulnerabilities. Lucien and his comrades began to see a pattern. Hitler's pause, intended as strategy, was inadvertently giving the resistance a breathing space. Across the Channel, RAF squadrons flew with heightened intensity. The Luftwaffe concentrated on precision bombing, aiming to crush Britain's industrial output. Londoners still huddled in shelters, but the city had adapted to raids. Underground stations doubled as schools, theaters, and clinics. Children recited lessons by candlelight. Nurses carried supplies in sacks across rubble-strewn streets, and pilots flew sorties with grim determination. Among them was Flight Lieutenant Edward Teddy Whittaker, a young man from Bristol. He had survived earlier raids, and now with the Luftwaffe focused solely on Britain, the pressure was immense. Every mission felt like it might be the last, and yet every successful sortie reinforced a fragile hope that the island could endure. In North Africa, Rommel noticed the German pivot westward with a mixture of frustration and opportunity. His Afrika Korps was concentrated against Tobruk, but reinforcements intended for the Russian front were now available. Tanks and supply trucks arrived with reliability, allowing more aggressive maneuvers. Yet, the Allies, aware of the shifted German focus, reinforced positions at El Alamein and across the desert. General Montgomery in Cairo reorganized the British Eighth Army, exploiting intelligence gathered from spies in Tripoli and Benghazi. The Desert War became a protracted game of attrition, where every sand dune could conceal a hidden ambush or a convoy ready to be trapped. In Moscow, Stalin's paranoia simmered beneath the surface. He could not understand why the Germans had delayed. Reports from spies hinted at internal disagreements in Berlin, logistical constraints, and overconfidence in the West. Stalin pushed generals to expand fortifications along the Western Front, to stockpile supplies, to prepare the Red Army for the inevitable confrontation. The delay allowed the Soviet Union to strengthen not only its defenses, but its command infrastructure. Communications networks improved, rail lines were reinforced, and reserves were trained to operate in concert rather than in isolated units. By the time German generals would eventually order the eastward offensive, they would find a Soviet Union far more formidable than they had anticipated in the original timeline. In Paris, Etienne Lefebvre continued his quiet work, documenting occupation and resistance. He noted subtle changes in German behavior. Troops fatigued by repetitive duties along the Channel coast, officers frustrated by fortification work, supply shortages caused by overextended logistics. Etienne began to write for underground presses, disseminating stories that inspired courage in ordinary citizens. Every act of defiance, no matter how small, became a thread in a growing network of resistance that might never have coalesced had Hitler invaded the East as planned. The delay also altered the colonial dimensions of the war. Indian troops, who had previously been dispatched in significant numbers to Burma and Malaya, found their training and deployment schedules changed. The British Empire's supply lines shifted emphasis, and logistical bottlenecks were alleviated slightly. Soldiers from Lahore, Madras, and Karachi experienced months of waiting, drilling, and preparation. Many wrote letters home, wondering whether the war would ever reach them, or if they would be asked to fight in Europe itself. Some families in Bengal and Punjab were spared the immediate terror of Japanese advance through Southeast Asia, buying time for more organized evacuation and relief efforts. In the Pacific, the Japanese observed the German pivot westward with interest. They debated strategy at length, understanding that Britain's resources were now stretched thinner over the Atlantic and the Channel. Plans for the invasion of Malaya and the eventual strike on Pearl Harbor were adjusted, timed differently, executed with slightly more precision. The entire timeline of Japanese expansion shifted subtly, changing the order of battles, the survival of key outposts, and the movement of naval fleets. The ripple effect of a single German decision in Berlin now stretched halfway around the globe. Back in Germany, Hitler remained convinced that consolidating the West would ensure total control over Europe. He believed that by the time the Soviet Union became a threat, the Reich would be fully fortified. Yet, the obsessive fortification of ports and cities drained resources, fatigued the soldiers, and created vulnerabilities elsewhere. German engineers in northern France sometimes argued with frustration over the inefficiency of moving men and materials repeatedly, while Allied intelligence mapped every road, bridge, and bunker for future exploitation. By late 1942, the world teetered on the edge of a new kind of war, not one dictated purely by blitzkrieg, but by patience, preparation, and subtle maneuvering. London had grown more confident. Moscow had grown stronger. Resistance networks in Europe had grown bolder. North Africa was a proving ground for commanders who would later rise to prominence. And through it all, millions of soldiers, civilians, and spies moved in ways that depended on the absence of a single German invasion. The war had not paused. It had merely reshaped itself around the consequences of a decision delayed by months. In a small village in Brittany, a farmer named Henri watched German trucks rumble along the new fortifications. He had once feared an immediate eastern deployment would remove most troops from France, leaving the countryside lightly guarded. Now, those soldiers remained, giving him both fear and opportunity. He whispered to his neighbors about hiding rifles, sabotaging rail tracks, and leaving subtle signs for passing Allied operatives. These acts of ordinary courage, multiplied across countless towns, became part of a hidden network that could later influence the outcomes of larger battles. In London, Churchill mused over maps and reports, realizing that history itself seemed to have paused. A single decision in Berlin, a delay, a cautious focus on the West, had transformed the entire trajectory of the conflict. Every plan, every battle, every engagement now carried the weight of that alternative reality. Strategists, politicians, and soldiers began to sense that while the world remained at war, the rules of engagement had shifted. Victory, defeat, survival. All depended now not only on force, but on timing, patience, and the unpredictable consequences of choices made behind closed doors. By the spring of 1943, the world had already diverged in subtle but profound ways. The delayed German invasion of the Soviet Union had given Moscow the breathing room it needed. Across the Western Front, German troops grew accustomed to monotony, drills, fortification work, and endless construction along the Atlantic Wall. Many of these men were young, inexperienced, and exhausted by the repetitive work. Their eyes dulled to the countryside they had once passed through with ambition and speed, their thoughts consumed by the endless task of preparing for a landing that might never come. In the forests outside Leningrad, Soviet generals smiled quietly at the reports of German hesitation. Artillery units were fully mobilized, supply depots reinforced, and reserve armies trained to coordinate with precision. Engineers had rerouted rail lines, stockpiled fuel, and hidden tanks behind dense tree lines. Winter coats had been issued in time, boots replaced before frostbite could strike, and medical units were organized in a way that had previously been impossible. The Soviets had effectively turned the delay into a force multiplier. When the Germans eventually turned their eyes eastward, they would find a prepared, organized, and disciplined opponent. In Paris, Lucien Moreau and his network of resistance fighters had grown bolder with each passing month. The delay in the Eastern Campaign meant that German troops remained in France longer, stretched thinner as they attempted to fortify the coastline. Railway depots, ammunition stores, and communication hubs were targeted with precision. Lucien had begun coordinating with British intelligence to organize more elaborate sabotage missions. Rail bridges blown up just hours before armored convoys were scheduled to pass. Telegraph lines cut to disrupt communications. Ordinary French citizens, who once cowered at the sight of German patrols, now participated quietly. The war was creeping into their lives in ways no one could have imagined, and the delay allowed them time to organize, learn, and survive. In London, Churchill paced the maps in his office late into the night. Intelligence reports indicated German overextension in France, and he began drafting contingency plans for an invasion of the continent, something that had seemed impossible only a year before. The British expeditionary forces were reconstituted, supply lines reinforced, and airborne divisions trained in detail for parachute operations. Churchill, his voice weary but resolute, told his aides, "The Germans have given us a gift in their indecision. We will take it, and we will shape history." His words carried the weight of possibility. For once, luck and strategy aligned in London. In North Africa, Rommel's campaign faced new challenges. While he had access to reinforcements originally meant for the Eastern Front, the British Eighth Army had also grown stronger. Montgomery had reorganized supply lines, trained new tank crews, and coordinated with intelligence agents who had provided maps of German positions and supply routes. The desert became a deadly game of chess, where every move was calculated, every supply truck a potential trap. Soldiers dug into sand dunes, artillery positions shifted by the hour, and the sun-baked earth bore the marks of constant struggle. Every delay in Berlin, every month the Germans had spent reinforcing Europe, had consequences that extended even to the deserts of Africa. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin grew increasingly confident, yet cautious. He had sent troops westward, knowing that the German army would eventually come, but now he could afford a calculated response rather than a reactive panic. Soviet tank divisions, trained over months rather than weeks, conducted exercises simulating German blitzkrieg attacks. Pilots flew long-range sorties to familiarize themselves with the terrain near Smolensk and Leningrad. Engineers built hidden roads and camouflaged bunkers, while intelligence units penetrated German communications more deeply than ever. The delay had transformed the Soviet Union from a vulnerable target into a prepared fortress. In the Pacific, Japanese commanders adjusted their strategy based on news from Europe. With Hitler focused on Western Europe, Britain was more heavily engaged in defending the Channel and industrial centers. Tokyo's military planners debated the timing of their strikes across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, realizing that delaying attacks could allow them to capture strategic positions with fewer obstacles. Burma, Malaya, and Singapore became prime targets for precision operations. The ripple effects of Berlin's single decision extended even across oceans and continents. In Berlin, Hitler remained obsessed with perfection in the West. Coastal fortifications were immense. Gun emplacements, minefields, bunkers. But in focusing on these, he inadvertently weakened the German capacity for flexible, fast-paced operations. Supply lines stretched thin, morale among troops diminished, and engineers grew exhausted. The very act of delaying Barbarossa had created new problems for the Reich, ones that could not be solved by orders alone. Each day brought subtle cracks in discipline, minor rebellions, and the quiet frustration of soldiers who were waiting to fight a war they now felt slipping away. In occupied France, the civilian population sensed the subtle shift in power. Farmers hid weapons in barns, schoolchildren carried messages between villages, and priests whispered encouragement in confessional rooms. Resistance cells became more sophisticated, with couriers, safe houses, and coded messages. Lucien Moreau's network grew, and operations expanded to include the interception of German supply convoys moving to the coast. Every delayed shipment, every misplaced order, created opportunities that were exploited relentlessly. Ordinary citizens, armed with courage and cleverness rather than rifles, began shaping the course of events in small but significant ways. By autumn, the strategic map of Europe had shifted dramatically. Moscow was stronger than expected. London had consolidated its forces. North Africa remained contested, but the Allies were better prepared. France teetered on the brink of a more organized insurgency. Hitler's focus on the West had unintended consequences. By the time he finally turned attention east, the Germans would face a Soviet Union that had fully mobilized, trained, and fortified its armies. The blitzkrieg that had once promised rapid victory now risked grinding into a slow, costly campaign. In the villages of northern Russia, ordinary peasants experienced the war in different ways than history had recorded. Wheat harvests continued, livestock remained tended, and supplies were moved to fortified towns. Soldiers trained alongside civilians, learning survival, engineering, and tactics. Families, while anxious, were spared immediate devastation. The pause in Barbarossa had given these communities months of preparation, months that would be crucial when the Wehrmacht finally arrived. In London, Allied strategists recognized the extraordinary opportunity. With Germany overextended, they began planning what would eventually become Operation Overlord earlier and with more preparation. Paratrooper divisions drilled, amphibious vehicles were tested, and coordination with resistance networks across France became more sophisticated. The British government, aided by American production, began stockpiling material for an invasion that now had a higher chance of success. Every German mistake, every strategic delay, became a potential turning point. In North Africa, the Desert Campaign continued to intensify. Rommel, despite additional reinforcements, faced a British army trained and prepared to exploit weaknesses created by German overcommitment in Europe. Supply lines became targets for Allied commandos. Intelligence revealed gaps in German planning. The sands of El Alamein and Tobruk were littered with the marks of slow attrition, and the Axis could no longer rely on quick victories. Every extra month spent reinforcing Western Europe had weakened their flexibility elsewhere. And so, by late 1943, the war had entered a state of prolonged tension. Battles were still fought, lives were still lost, but the world was different. The pause in Berlin, a single cautious decision, had transformed not only strategy but human experience. Soldiers, civilians, engineers, and leaders adapted to the new rhythm of conflict, shaping history in ways that would never be fully recorded. Ordinary people became extraordinary actors, whether through resistance, innovation, or endurance. Innovation or endurance. Even in small, overlooked places, a village in Brittany, a rail depot in Belgium, a factory in Moscow, a desert outpost in North Africa. The consequences of delayed action were visible. The war was no longer a straightforward path of conquest and retreat. It had become a web of calculated maneuvers, human ingenuity, and unintended outcomes. Each day, each decision, carried more weight than anyone could measure, and the future of Europe, Asia, and the Pacific hung in the balance. By the winter of 1943, the German army finally turned its gaze eastward. Barbarossa, long delayed, was launched with a calculated precision that Hitler believed would compensate for lost time. The Wehrmacht, however, faced an enemy unlike the one they had expected. The Soviet Union, strengthened by months of preparation, was no longer vulnerable to a rapid blitzkrieg. Trenches were deeper, tank units were better coordinated, artillery was pre-positioned, and supply lines were hidden behind layers of deception. Every village, every forest, every river crossing had been anticipated and fortified. In the outskirts of Smolensk, Captain Ivan Petrov's unit waited in silent anticipation. The young men and women of the Red Army had trained relentlessly, their nerves sharpened by months of drills and winter maneuvers. They were no longer the scattered, underprepared force of history. They were organized, disciplined, and ready. Petrov traced the lines of his tanks, checking fuel and ammunition, while radio operators monitored distant German movements. The tension in the air was palpable, but there was also a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from preparation and survival. Further west, in France, Lucien Moreau's resistance cell moved with increasing daring. The delay in the Eastern Campaign had left German divisions in France longer than anticipated, stretched thin along the Atlantic Wall. Moreau coordinated a series of sabotage operations that targeted rail lines and ammunition depots meant for the Eastern Front. Trains exploded in midnight raids, bridges crumbled under carefully placed explosives, and communication networks were disrupted systematically. Ordinary citizens, from farmers to shopkeepers, became silent allies, hiding weapons and providing shelter to operatives. Each successful strike strengthened the morale of the resistance and weakened the Wehrmacht's ability to respond elsewhere. In London, Churchill watched the reports with cautious optimism. The pause in Barbarossa had bought precious time for the Allies to strengthen their positions. Paratroopers had completed advanced training exercises, amphibious landing plans were refined, and intelligence networks across occupied Europe had expanded dramatically. Every intercepted German dispatch provided insight into troop movements, fortification weaknesses, and morale issues. British planners realized that when the time came, an invasion of the continent would have a higher chance of success than it would have in the original timeline. In North Africa, Rommel faced a dilemma. The German reinforcements he had received earlier were now partially redirected to the Western Front. While his Africa Corps remained formidable, the logistical strain began to take its toll. British forces, trained with intelligence from spies and aided by American supplies, prepared to push back with coordinated offensives. The desert became a battlefield of attrition, where every missed supply convoy, every delayed reinforcement, could tip the balance. Rommel moved with his usual cunning, but the advantage of surprise had diminished. In Berlin, Hitler's obsession with perfection in the West had cost the Reich more than he realized. The delay in the Eastern Campaign had allowed the Soviet Union to consolidate, and the Wehrmacht now faced a prepared and resilient enemy. Officers reported logistical challenges: roads destroyed, railways sabotaged, and tank units caught in frozen mud during early winter maneuvers. Morale among German soldiers wavered. They had been promised a swift, decisive campaign in the East, and now they faced a grinding confrontation with an enemy who had learned patience, cunning, and coordination. In Moscow, Stalin monitored the unfolding campaign with a mixture of apprehension and satisfaction. The months of preparation had paid off. Soviet units executed counterattacks with precision. Artillery barrages struck supply lines before they reached frontline troops, and tank divisions flanked German units in unexpected ways. Intelligence had predicted German tactics based on previous campaigns, allowing commanders to anticipate movements and exploit weaknesses. The Red Army, once considered vulnerable, now struck with strategic calculation, and each small victory bolstered morale across the front. In Paris, Lucien Moreau received coded messages from London detailing the arrival of Allied commando units. Coordinating with these forces, the resistance intensified operations, targeting communications hubs and supply depots in anticipation of larger Allied movements. The Germans, already stretched and demoralized, struggled to contain the waves of sabotage. Ordinary citizens risked their lives to hide explosives, deliver messages, and provide intelligence. The war, once distant in their minds, had become immediate, personal, and deadly. In London, pilots of the Royal Air Force flew relentless sorties over northern France, harassing German supply convoys and fortifications. Air superiority had improved significantly, thanks to months of uninterrupted training and planning. Squadrons targeted rail junctions, ammunition depots, and armored units, weakening German capacity to respond effectively. Every sortie was dangerous, yet the pilots flew with a sense of purpose born from months of preparation and a belief that they could turn the tide of war. In the Soviet heartland, civilians felt the shift in momentum. Cities that had once feared immediate invasion now experienced relative calm, allowing evacuations and industrial relocation to proceed in a more orderly manner. Factories, hospitals, and schools had been moved eastward, often hidden in forests and small towns. The delay in the German invasion had saved countless lives, and every victory on the front reinforced the resilience of the nation. Families prayed quietly for the soldiers they would never see again. hoping that the preparation and patience instilled over the months would be enough to survive the coming battles. In Berlin, frustration and obsession gnawed at Hitler. Reports of Soviet resilience, Allied preparation, and resistance operations in France reached his office daily. He pressed for more rapid movement, more discipline, and harsher enforcement of order. Yet, the Wehrmacht's strength was no longer concentrated as he had hoped. Divisions were fatigued, logistics were stretched thin, and morale was fragile. The grand plan of conquest, once so clear in his mind, now faced delays, failures, and unexpected resistance at every turn. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the desert campaigns intensified. British and American forces, better coordinated and informed, launched counteroffensives against Axis positions. Rommel, despite his tactical brilliance, faced shortages of fuel and ammunition. Sandstorms, heat, and attrition compounded the challenge. The delay in German focus on the east had allowed the Allies to adapt, turning what would have been minor skirmishes into major engagements. Each victory in the desert inspired soldiers and civilians alike, creating a new rhythm in the global conflict that had once seemed predetermined. In occupied France, the resistance began to coordinate with Allied intelligence to prepare for an eventual invasion. Safe houses multiplied, couriers moved with increasing efficiency, and local populations provided food, information, and shelter. Lucien Moreau's network became a critical hub in this effort. He knew that the pause in Barbarossa had given them time to train, plan, and strike. Every delayed shipment, every overextended German division became an opportunity. Ordinary people, armed with ingenuity and courage rather than guns, now shaped the trajectory of the war in profound ways. By the end of 1943, the delayed German campaign had created a ripple effect across the world. The Soviet Union was prepared, the Allies were strengthened, North Africa was contested but gaining ground, and resistance networks in Europe were expanding. Japan, observing developments in Europe, adjusted its own strategies across the Pacific, altering the timeline of operations in Burma, Malaya, and Pearl Harbor. A single decision, the delay of Barbarossa, had transformed global strategy, creating new opportunities and challenges for all sides. Even in small, overlooked villages, the consequences were felt. Farmers hid supplies for the resistance, engineers repaired railways for evacuation and military movement. Children learned to navigate the dangers of occupation, and families adapted to a new rhythm of uncertainty and preparation. Every life touched by the war had shifted subtly, yet profoundly. The world was still at war, but it was no longer the world history had recorded. And somewhere, in the quiet moments between battles, soldiers, civilians, and leaders alike began to sense the extraordinary weight of a single decision. The pause, the delay, the choice made in Berlin months earlier had allowed the tides of war to bend in unexpected directions. History, once thought fixed, had become fluid, shaped not only by battles and guns, but by preparation, timing, and the resilience of ordinary people. The year 1944 arrived with a chill in the European air, but the continent was poised differently than anyone had expected. The Wehrmacht, finally moving east in force, encountered a Soviet Union that was no longer hesitant, no longer unprepared. The months gained from Hitler's delay had allowed Stalin's generals to fully implement fortified positions, well-stocked supply lines, and advanced coordination among tank divisions, infantry, and artillery. When the German columns crossed the western Soviet border, they met not the hasty defenses of 1941, but a disciplined and deeply entrenched army. In the outskirts of Smolensk, Captain Ivan Petrov observed the German advance with a grim sense of inevitability tempered by confidence. Trenches and concealed artillery positions had been constructed over months, camouflage perfected, and every river crossing had been mined or rigged with traps. Soviet soldiers, hardened by winter exercises and long drills, moved with precision. Tank crews executed flanking maneuvers that the Germans had not anticipated. The speed of German advance, once overwhelming, was now checked at every mile. What had been expected to be a rapid campaign of conquest turned into a grinding, attritional struggle. Farther north, in Leningrad, civilians had adjusted to the rhythm of siege and preparation. Food shortages were mitigated by careful rationing and hidden supplies, while factories operated behind camouflaged walls, producing munitions and medical equipment. Nurses, school teachers, and volunteers moved quietly among the wounded and the hungry, sustaining the population. Young men who had trained for months now took positions in anti-tank defenses, while Soviet engineers repaired bridges under cover of darkness, preparing for the inevitable German assaults. The delay in Barbarossa had transformed a chaotic and desperate front into a calculated, resilient stronghold. In Paris, Lucien Moreau and his network sensed the tides shifting once again. Resistance operations intensified as German troops were pulled east. Trains carrying reinforcements and supplies were sabotaged relentlessly, rail bridges destroyed, communication lines severed. Ordinary citizens, from shopkeepers to students, risked their lives to aid the resistance. Moreau coordinated with British intelligence to prepare for a larger Allied invasion. The early planning for what would become D-Day was already underway. Each act of sabotage, each whispered message, became part of a vast, unseen network that would tip the balance in the coming months. Across the English Channel, Churchill and his generals watched the intelligence reports with keen anticipation. The Royal Navy had learned more about German fortifications than ever before, and the RAF maintained air superiority over the Channel and northern France. Paratrooper units completed complex drills, rehearsing landings and sabotage missions behind enemy lines. For the first time, Allied leadership believed that a cross-channel invasion could succeed not as a desperate gamble, but as a calculated strike supported by years of preparation and intelligence. The delay in the Eastern Campaign had given them a window, one that could change the course of the war entirely. In North Africa, the campaign had reached a critical stage. Rommel, despite his tactical brilliance, faced increasingly coordinated Allied forces. Supply shortages, compounded by redirection of German resources to Western Europe, hampered his movements. British and American forces exploited these vulnerabilities with careful offensives, using intelligence to anticipate attacks. The desert, once a theater of fast maneuvers, became a place of attrition and calculation. Soldiers learned to rely not only on skill, but on timing and strategy, turning every minor victory into a critical advantage. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin met with his generals in the Kremlin. Maps sprawled across the table showed German advances checked at every turn. Soviet tank units executed counterattacks with precision. Artillery destroyed bridges and supply lines, and infantry defended towns with methodical determination. The Red Army, strengthened by months of preparation, fought with a cohesion that had been impossible in the original timeline. Stalin, usually impatient and suspicious, allowed a rare moment of satisfaction, understanding that the delay had given them not only time, but strategic advantage. In occupied France, the anticipation of Allied landings spread quietly but resolutely. Safe houses multiplied, couriers became adept at moving undetected, and civilians participated in preparations with courage and ingenuity. Lucien Moreau coordinated with parachute teams sent from Britain, planning disruptions to communications, sabotage of fortifications, and rapid support for advancing forces. Ordinary citizens, often overlooked in history, became decisive participants in shaping events. Each delayed shipment, each distracted German unit, became a thread woven into the larger fabric of liberation. In London, Flight Lieutenant Edward Whittaker prepared for what would be the most critical air operations of his career. Sorties over northern France targeted rail lines, ammunition depots, and armored units, weakening German positions ahead of the invasion. Each successful mission allowed intelligence to confirm enemy locations and vulnerabilities. Pilots flew with a mixture of fear and determination, aware that the lives of thousands on the ground depended on their accuracy and courage. The months gained from Hitler's delay had transformed these operations from hasty interventions into carefully planned strikes with strategic impact. In the Soviet rear, civilians continued to contribute quietly but decisively. Factories hidden in forests and small towns produced munitions and supplies without pause. Engineers reinforced roads and railways, ensuring movement of troops and equipment would be smooth. Schools and hospitals operated under strain but with organization, and families, though anxious, understood that the war now moved on a slower, more deliberate pace. The delay had given them time to survive, to prepare, and to resist, in ways that would later influence both military and civilian resilience. In Berlin, Hitler grew increasingly frustrated. Reports indicated that German divisions, once confident in rapid eastern conquest, were bogged down by unexpected resistance. Morale among soldiers dipped. Logistical failures mounted. The obsessive focus on Western Europe had delayed the ultimate objective, and the Wehrmacht now faced a Soviet Union that was ready, organized, and unrelenting. Officers whispered concerns about overstretched supply lines, exhausted troops, and the impossibility of sustaining the offensive over months of attritional warfare. Yet Hitler remained resolute, demanding speed, discipline, and absolute obedience, unaware that his earlier decision to delay had already shifted the balance irrevocably. By mid-1944, Allied forces in Britain prepared for the invasion of Normandy. Months of preparation, reconnaissance, and resistance coordination had created an unprecedented opportunity. Paratroopers were poised to land behind enemy lines, sabotage German defenses, and open the way for infantry and armored divisions. Lucien Moreau's networks in France had mapped safe routes, hidden arms, and prepared local populations to assist advancing forces. The delay in Barbarossa had allowed the Allies to strengthen every aspect of their strategy, increasing the chances of success dramatically. In the Pacific, Japan adjusted its operations in response to European developments. With Hitler focused on Western Europe, Britain remained tied to the Channel and Atlantic defenses. Japanese planners saw an opportunity to consolidate control in Southeast Asia before American forces could fully mobilize. The timeline of Japanese advances in Burma, Malaya, and the Philippines shifted, creating new patterns of occupation, resistance, and military engagement. A single decision in Berlin had created ripple effects that now reached halfway across the world, shaping battles and strategies thousands of miles away. In Moscow, the Red Army launched its own offensives. Soviet intelligence predicted German movements based on months of observation, enabling preemptive strikes. Armored divisions flanked advancing units, artillery destroyed supply lines, and infantry held towns against sustained attacks. Soldiers, trained in extended campaigns rather than rushed reactions, executed maneuvers with precision. The Wehrmacht, exhausted and overextended, struggled against this prepared and resilient force. Each German loss, each stalled advance, reinforced the extraordinary impact of the delay that had reshaped the war. In occupied France, the resistance coordinated with advancing Allied units as the D-Day invasion began. The long-prepared sabotage, intelligence gathering, and clandestine support proved decisive. German units, stretched thin and fatigued by months of fortification work, were unable to respond effectively. Ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, schoolteachers became heroes in their own right, providing critical aid to advancing forces. Lucien Moreau witnessed history in motion, understanding that the months of patience, preparation, and small acts of courage had created a turning point that few would fully recognize. And so, by late 1944, the war had entered its final phase in Europe. The delayed Barbarossa had transformed the conflict. The Soviet Union was prepared and resilient. The Allies were coordinated and powerful. North Africa had shifted toward Allied control. and resistance networks across Europe had grown into formidable forces. One decision, a pause, a single reconsideration in Berlin had altered timelines, human experiences, and the very shape of the global conflict. History had been rewritten not by a single battle, but by the consequences of careful preparation, patience, and unintended opportunities. Spring 1945 arrived with a brittle chill in Europe, but the continent was already unrecognizable from the one history had once recorded. The delayed Barbarossa had reshaped the war in ways no general, leader, or historian could have fully anticipated. The Soviet Union, fully prepared and fortified by months of delay, had slowly pushed the Wehrmacht back. Tank divisions executed sweeping maneuvers with precision, artillery barrages destroyed supply lines, and infantry units held towns and cities that in the original timeline would have fallen with shocking rapidity. Moscow, Leningrad, Stalingrad. These names no longer carried the stigma of rapid defeat. They symbolized resilience, preparation, and strategic foresight. Captain Ivan Petrov surveyed the battlefield near Smolensk. Snow still clung to the ground in patches, remnants of winter battles fought over months of grinding conflict. German units, exhausted and depleted, were finally in retreat. Petrov's men had endured months of tension, ambushes, and artillery duels, and now the fruits of preparation became visible. Villages that had been fortified with painstaking care were finally retaken. Civilians emerged cautiously from shelters, their eyes wide with relief and disbelief. Families reunited, children cried, and the survivors whispered prayers of gratitude to those who had held the line, to the engineers, soldiers, and planners who had transformed delay into victory. In Paris, Lucien Moreau walked through streets that bore the scars of occupation and resistance alike. The Allied invasion had succeeded beyond expectation. German divisions, stretched thin and demoralized by years of fortification labor in France, had failed to respond effectively. Resistance networks had provided critical intelligence, sabotaged critical infrastructure, and guided paratroopers safely behind enemy lines. Ordinary citizens who had quietly risked their lives over months now watched as liberation arrived. Moreau paused in front of a shattered railway bridge, once the site of repeated sabotage missions, and felt the weight of months of careful, dangerous preparation. Each small act, each whispered plan, each hidden message had contributed to the liberation. In London, Churchill allowed himself a rare smile. The war in Europe was nearing its end, and the Atlantic had been secured, the Channel crossed, and the continental push underway with remarkable efficiency. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Wehrmacht's failures were rooted not in raw strength, but in overextension and exhausted morale, consequences of the very delay Hitler had imposed. British forces moved with confidence, paratroopers had secured key positions, and Allied planners anticipated every possible German counterattack. Every victory owed itself, in part, to patience, preparation, and the unintended effects of a single strategic pause. In North Africa, Rommel's campaigns had long concluded, with Allied forces consolidating control across the desert. The Axis had been forced to withdraw, hindered by redirection of resources to Western Europe and months of Allied preparation. Supply lines once expected to support rapid campaigns were now inadequate, turning the deserts into landscapes of attrition rather than conquest. Soldiers, both Axis and Allied, remembered the relentless heat, sandstorms, and engagements where every decision carried life or death consequences. The war in the Mediterranean had been transformed, proving that timing and patience could be as decisive as courage and tactics. In Moscow, Stalin convened a final series of councils. The Red Army had pressed west, reclaiming territory with precision. Generals who had once feared German speed now celebrated the coordination and training that had allowed them to anticipate every move. Cities liberated under Soviet control were carefully stabilized, supply chains repaired, and civilian populations reassured. Factories that had been hidden for months resumed production, hospitals treated the wounded, and schools reopened cautiously. The delay in Barbarossa had allowed these systems to mature, producing a Soviet Union capable of not just resisting invasion, but shaping the outcome of the war. In occupied villages across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, ordinary citizens emerged from months of fear and clandestine activity. Farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, and children had all participated in ways small and large, hiding weapons, passing intelligence, and providing refuge to those on missions of sabotage. Their courage, once quiet and invisible, became visible in the liberation of towns, the reclaiming of streets, and the eventual retreat of German forces. Lucien Moreau walked among them, witnessing the human impact of a war that had been altered by delay, preparation, and resilience. In Berlin, the Reich crumbled under the dual pressures of retreating eastern and western fronts. Soldiers, fatigued, demoralized, and overextended, surrendered or fled. The obsessive focus on western fortifications had delayed Barbarossa, but the cost had been high. Overextension, misallocated resources, and strategic mistakes that now contributed to the Reich's collapse. Hitler's vision, once grand and seemingly unstoppable, dissolved under the weight of a prepared opposition and the cumulative effects of a single delayed decision. Across the Pacific, Japan felt the ripple effects of Berlin's earlier choice. With European powers better prepared, the timing of Allied engagement in the Pacific had been altered. Japanese operations in Burma, Malaya, and the Philippines faced more coordinated resistance, stronger logistical challenges, and a better-informed opponent. American forces, aided indirectly by the consequences of German delays, were able to project power across the Pacific more effectively. Campaigns that had once been expected to last months now concluded more swiftly, and the eventual Japanese surrender came with the added impact of a global conflict reshaped by distant decisions. In the quiet villages of Western Russia, peasants and civilians who had survived years of uncertainty now emerged to rebuild their homes and lives. Children played among fields once scarred by artillery. Families planted crops in soil still marked by frost and battle. And entire communities reflected on the months of preparation and patience that had preserved life and allowed victory. The war had not spared them hardships, but the delay of one German campaign had transformed devastation into resilience, chaos into careful organization, and fear into cautious hope. Even in the smallest acts, a French mother hiding weapons in her cellar, a Soviet engineer reinforcing a bridge, a British pilot executing a perfect bombing run. The consequences of that single pause in Berlin became apparent. History, once fixed in brutal certainty, had been altered by timing, patience, and human ingenuity. Ordinary people, often overlooked in textbooks and chronicles, had shaped outcomes in ways that generals, politicians, and historians could scarcely appreciate. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe concluded with a series of victories that were both hard-fought and unexpected. The delayed German campaign had allowed the Allies and the Soviet Union to prepare in ways that ensured success, reduced unnecessary destruction, and gave civilians the chance to survive and resist. The human cost, though still high, was mitigated in ways that the original timeline could never have allowed. Europe, though scarred, had been saved from the most rapid and devastating of occupations. Lucien Moreau walked through a liberated Paris, observing the mix of jubilation and solemn reflection. Children ran in the streets, women and men embraced, and the ruins of occupation were slowly cleared. In the same city, soldiers who had once patrolled heavily fortified streets now returned to homes they had left behind, carrying stories of resistance, survival, and quiet heroism. The months of delay in Barbarossa had allowed these ordinary individuals to become extraordinary, to shape history in ways unseen yet undeniable. In Moscow, Captain Petrov reflected on the months of preparation that had transformed his army from a vulnerable target into an unstoppable force. He thought of the villages saved, the civilians protected, and the soldiers trained and disciplined. Every maneuver, every defensive line, every pre-positioned artillery unit had been part of a larger plan shaped by months of strategic breathing room. The Wehrmacht had underestimated patience, foresight, and resilience, and it had cost them dearly. And so, in this alternate world, the war ended not merely through sheer force, but through the extraordinary consequences of one delayed decision. Lives were shaped, battles won, and history rewritten by patience, preparation, and the courage of ordinary people. One choice in Berlin, a pause in a campaign that seemed inevitable, had rippled across continents and oceans, affecting soldiers, civilians, generals, and nations alike. The world had been altered not by a single battle, but by the profound and unpredictable weight of timing, human ingenuity, and endurance. As peace slowly returned, Europe, Asia, and the Pacific reflected on what had been lost and what had been saved. Stories of bravery, ingenuity, and quiet heroism filled letters, memoirs, and whispered accounts in villages and cities. Ordinary lives, shaped by extraordinary circumstances, became the true testament to the unpredictability of history. One pause in Berlin had changed everything. The course of the war, the survival of millions, and the way the world would remember courage, sacrifice, and the fragile threads of destiny.